Hello, my dears, and welcome back to the Horus Heresy. Welcome back to one of the most important, if not the most important books in the entire series. Important on a number of levels, both on a personal level, because it deals with one of my favourite legions, but also on a meta level, in the sense that this book changes and establishes so much about the history of obviously the Thousand Sons, but also about the Space Wolves, about the nature of the Imperium, about the Emperor. There's so much in this book that shatters what went before, or that sets up implications and mysteries that were just never present before. For one thing, the time scale of this book is enormous. It's absolutely enormous. It starts in sort of like the height of the Great Crusade, when the utopian vision of the Imperium is at its very, very height, and everything is going great guns. Everything is ostensibly working. The Emperor's vision, the Emperor's ideology, the absolute truth of Imperial dogma seems to be absolute. It seems to be spreading across the galaxy at a fair old pace, and everyone believes in it, and everyone is doing their jobs and doing what is necessary. And then it spans entire decades, and then comes to the outbreak of the Horus Heresy. So you have the burning of Prospero at the very end, which is one of the most climactic and interesting events in the entire series. It's always been one of my favourite stories in the Horus Heresy, and this book just fleshes it out enormously. One of the things that I love about this book more than anything is how it characterizes the Thousand Sons. Most of the Thousand Sons that are depicted specifically here are characters that we have seen before, and we will be seeing again, not only in the Horus Heresy series, but far later on in John French's Ahriman series, in Aaron Dembski-Bowden's Black Legion series. There are so many characters that are established here that are part and parcel of the Thousand Sons that come to be key players in the later events. Essentially, the book is it's from sort of three primary perspectives. Arzek Ahriman. Ahriman is kind of the protagonist of this book, and this is long before he becomes the unwitting arch champion of Zeech that he ultimately becomes. At this point, he is just the chief librarian of the Thousand Sons. I say just. That's a lofty position. That means that he is next in line to Magnus himself. He is a very, very, very knowledgeable, very wise, very powerful sorcerer at this point. Psyker, I suppose. They don't really consider themselves sorcerers at this point. But he's high within the ranking of the Thousand Sons. But what I love about it is that the Thousand Sons are one of the most absolutely human of the existing Space Marine legions. It's a pattern that you find throughout the Horus Heresy, actually. The legions that tend to fall are the ones that are the most humane. They're the ones that retain the most of their previous humanity. And isn't that fascinating? Because the Thousand Sons have this really interesting dichotomy going on here. They are simultaneously one of the closest to humanity, alongside the likes of the Word-Bearers and the Emperor's Children, in that they retain a lot of their human drives, a lot of their human emotions. They've got a cracking sense of humour. Ahriman and his sort of subsect, which are the Corvidae, of the Thousand Sons, they interact with the human beings of Prospero, with remembrances and whatnot, and they share wine with them, they laugh, they have jokes, they extemporize, they talk about things like politics and philosophy, and they do it in this very human way, in a way that is not as intimidating as other Space Marine legions. Ahriman has this constant entourage around him of remembrances, of artisans and philosophers and scholars from Prospero, who he just talks with, he just sort of interacts with and chats with, and it's wonderful to see. It's absolutely wonderful. The Thousand Sons retain this sense of humanity about them, yet at the same time, they have this elevation, not only from humanity, but from the other Space Marines as well. And this does breed a kind of arrogance in them. But it's an arrogance that the book takes pains to establish. It's not entirely unfounded. They are not like the other Space Marine legions. They're not like their brothers at all. They're not even like the wider Imperium, really, because they operate on these other planes of existence, these other planes of experience. They are, to a one, extremely puissant, powerful psychers. They are attuned to the warp, to secrets of creation, of existence, that the other Space Marine legions, even some of the other Primarchs, could not even imagine. So they operate on this level that is almost entirely beyond anyone else in the Imperium, barring the likes of Malkador and the Emperor. They can see what the other Space Marine legions can't, but they also have ambitions far, 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 far beyond what the Great Crusade prescribes. To them, the Great Crusade is not a conservative effort. It is not to sort of batten down the hatches. It's not it's not so that humanity can prepare for some great metaphysical siege or something. No, 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 no. That's not what it's about. What they want is to facilitate an awakening. They want transcendence. It's what Magnus wants. It's what the Thousand Sons themselves want. They want to facilitate a psychic transcendence in which humanity awakens to the warp, to its metaphysical self, so that humanity isn't something to be protected for the Thousand Sons. It's something to be transgressed beyond. It's something to be transcended. And it's a really lofty ambition. What that means is that they have ambitions and a foresight that's far and beyond the Great Crusade itself. Unlike other Space Marine legions, like the Space Wolves, for example, they don't just see themselves as instruments or as tools to wage war. In fact, they actually don't really like waging war at all. They, as the book establishes, they find it quite wasteful. They find it really sad when they have to destroy cultures, or when they have to bombard peoples out of existence who they could learn from, or who they could invite into the wider Imperium to enhance it in some way. So they do get into quite a lot of trouble throughout the course of the book for doing things like engaging in diplomacy when perhaps the Imperium prescribes otherwise. They are highly diplomatic, these guys. And because they are so intelligent, because they are so reasonable, because they are so charming, they often succeed. They often succeed in bringing otherwise divergent or deviant folds of humanity into the Imperium, and even establishing means by which they can conform to Imperial dogma whilst at the same time retaining a lot of their traditions and a lot of their knowledge. It's really cool. The Thousand Sons, for me, represent the ideal at this point. They are what the Imperium could be at its most utopian, at its most ascended, alongside the likes of the Emperor's Children, who do something very similar. Very, very similar. The Thousand Sons are a different entity. They are not like other Space Marine legions, and the book goes really far to establish that. And Ahriman, this is the first time, by the way, we get his first name, Arzek. His name is Arzek Ahriman. And it's the first time we get a real insight into who he is, and he's quite a fun guy. Like a lot of the guys who will go on to become some of the greatest, most villainous antagonists of this setting, Ahriman is quite fun. He's got a sense of humour. He treats what he does with this sense of distance. It's like he doesn't get lost in the profundity of it. He retains this sense of equanimity, which is why Magnus keeps him around, keeps him on his right hand, because he keeps Magnus grounded. He keeps Magnus grounded. Magnus himself, wow, Magnus is another order of entity entirely in this book. A lot is changed about Magnus the Red in this book from what has been established previously. What people tend to forget is prior to this book, there were lots of contradictions about Magnus. Lots of contradictions. Some of the background established that he was born a Cyclops. Some established that he bartered the eye away for some reason. What this book does is it takes all of the previous contradictions and weaves them into the same mythology. So the thing with Magnus that this book establishes, he is so far beyond any other entity in the 40k universe, barring the likes of Malkador and the Emperor, that he is a mass of contradictions. That's his nature. It's actually very difficult to be in his presence because he is like, he seethes with psychic energy all the time. His form is constantly wavering and shifting, and sometimes when you look at him, you see something different. Sometimes it's the giant red-skinned titan. Sometimes it's this kind of withered, hooded scholar. Sometimes it's something else, you know? So being in his presence is difficult. It's actually difficult to communicate with him in that regard. He's also psychologically contradictory as well. There are lots of different facets to his personality. He is not just one creature in that regard. And those facets are constantly they're in conflict with one another and in communication with one another as well. He's a fascinatingly complex creature. You have established in this book that early on, when the Thousand Sons first came to Prospero, when the Emperor first came to Prospero, the Thousand Sons were in dire straits. The flesh curse was running rampant throughout them, and there was talk of them being just completely obliterated, which a lot of their brother legions actually wanted, by the way. But Magnus swore that he'd find a way to save them. He'd use his knowledge to find a way to save them, and he does. He delves into the warp and he finds an entity. He finds an entity that he considers to be kind of like a projection of his own ambition. It's just another sort of psychic storm. To him, it's nothing that significant, and he feels that he can win in a game of wits against it. So he barters away his eye, basically, barters away one eye for the knowledge to save his legion, and the entity grants it. That deal is granted. And, of course, what we know as the reader is the entity is Zeech, and Magnus has allowed his arrogance to blind him. That's the sort of symbolism of the pact. But it does work. It does work. Now, Magnus is given the knowledge to halt or to forestall the flesh curse. However, what the book also establishes early on is that it's not as cured as Magnus perhaps believes. There are a couple of instances where the flesh curse returns, and it's a thing of absolute and utter horror to the Thousand Sons. The flesh curse is the worst thing they can imagine. All of their knowledge, all of their hard-fought wisdom, their desire for transcendence ending in madness and gibbering abomination. Irony, you know, given what they become, given what they come to revere and worship, there's a particular level of really sad and sorrowful irony here. But the book also establishes that Magnus is the closest in nature and demeanour of the Primarchs to the Emperor. He's the one who knows the Emperor the best, because, of course, he can commune with the Emperor in ways the others can't even imagine. He can commune with him on the level of the warp. He can see him for what he is. He actually knows loads about the warp, about the entities in it, that the others don't. He's kind of the Emperor's right-hand man in that regard. The Emperor can confide in Magnus in a way that he can't confide in the others, because they know one another. You even have a sequence where Lorgar points out that Magnus is the most powerful of the Primarchs by a country mile. Magnus could wipe the floor with all of the other Primarchs, probably most of them put together, for the simple reason that he's not just as physically capable as they are, if not more so, because he's massive. Magnus is sort of a giant, you know? But he also has the psychic capabilities as well. It's one of the things this book does, which I really love. It takes some of the problems about the story that existed before, about the raising of Prospero, for example, and it explains them. For example, we all know that when Magnus fights Leman Russ at the end, Leman Russ wins and breaks Magnus over his knee, and that does happen. But the reason he's able to do it is because he's aided. He's aided by the Sisters of Silence that nullify Magnus's psychic powers. Were it not for that, as Leman Russ himself admits, were it not for that, Magnus would have just clicked his fingers and melted him. Would have just melted him to bits. And Leman is aware of this. He's absolutely aware of this. The antagonism between Leman Russ and Magnus the Red is really well drawn here. Again, this is one of the first books that deals with the Space Wolves specifically, and they don't come off well. I'm telling you, they do not come off well. Okay, a lot of it is through the perspectives of the Thousand Sons, but they just come off as mindless bigots. They really do. Barbarians, desecrators, where the Thousand Sons are trying to say, wait, give us some time, let us have some patience here. The Space Wolves will just opt for genocide. They will just fall on a planet and hack its population to bits and raise everything to the ground. Whereas the Thousand Sons will say, just wait. There might be something beautiful here. There might be something worth saving here. There are actually sequences in the book where they come to blows, but the Thousand Sons aren't fighting the Space Wolves. They're trying to hold them back. The Space Wolves are very happy to murder their brothers. Just like that, on a whim, because they are barbarians, and they're bastards. In this series, the Space Wolves are deliberately drawn as bigots, hypocrites, barbarians, just hideous characters, and it's deliberate. It's clearly deliberate. That's what they're supposed to be. It is a deliberate condemnation of the Legion. There's a point where the Thousand Sons are trying to spare this library of sort of alien knowledge on this planet that they've assaulted, and the Space Wolves are trying to burn it down. But the Thousand Sons are saying, just wait, will you? Just wait, and let us... You can burn it after. That's fine, but let us have a look first, you know? And the Thousand Sons are trying to hold them back with these psychic shields, while the Space Wolves are all for killing them. The Thousand Sons do not raise a blade against their brothers, but the Space Wolves are all for killing them. And it's appalling, it really is. They come off as so bad. And Leman Russ himself is the worst. He's the worst of all of them. There's a point in it where Leman Russ is arguing with Magnus the Red about how much he hates the sorcery and how unclean it is. But then Magnus throws right back at him, well, you do it. Your Legion does it all the fucking time. You've got your Graciers and whatnot, you know? And they do it all the time. And Lehman is like, oh, yes, well, that's different because that comes from the world of... that comes from the bedrock of our world. It's kind of like a pantheistic thing that we do, and it's purer than what you do. But Magnus just snorts at him and says, look, you have been conditioned to think that. Right? You've been conditioned to think that by the mythologies you were raised in, but it's sorcery. It's just another word. You use a different word for it. It's exactly the same. And he's right. He's absolutely right. Everything are they called the Graciers or whatever? You know, the rune, the psychic guys from the shamanistic guys from the Space Wolves. I can't remember what they're called off the top of my head, but the sort of worldly druidic powers that they seem to manifest are all just sorcery by a different name. And Magnus points this out. He even tells Lehman that the reason the sorceries they manifest take the shapes that they do, that they seem to be drawn from this old world spirit or whatever, is because that's what they believe. That's the reason. It's no different. And he's absolutely right. And Lehman responds with violence. He actually attacks Magnus at that point. And it's like, you fucker. Just because you've been caught in your hypocrisy, you utter wanker. He's a horrible character, Lehman Russ. He really is in this book. And Magnus comes off as entirely reasonable. Yeah, he is arrogant. Yeah, he is blinded by it. He believes that he is going to be this grand shepherd of humanity. And that when it's done, when humanity transcends and becomes this polyglot psychic entity in the warp, that he is going to be like praised and he's going to be revered as the shepherd of his kind, and that's what leads to his fall ultimately. But it's sad. It's really sad because you realise that he's been duped from the very beginning. He really is. Zeech is there from the very beginning and is manipulating everything. Of course he is. I mean, that's Zeech's nature. Of course he is. And Magnus doesn't really have a prayer. He doesn't have a hope because Zeech knows him so well. Zeech has already touched him at this point, and that's part of the reason why he's so psychically powerful, you know? But a lot of the time, Magnus is right in this book. His arguments are good. They're really good. And he makes sense, especially when it comes to the Council of Nicaea, which is is conducted later on in the book. There's a really horrible sequence actually where the Space Wolves send envoys to the Thousand Sons to sort of work alongside them, as happens amongst the Space Marine legions. This is what happens. They send envoys to one another, and they fight alongside one another so that they might learn, and so they might keep an eye on one another. And there's this particular Space Wolf, whatever they're called, the Shamans, I can't remember. Rune Priest, is that what they're called? The Rune Priests, yeah? And he seems to get on with Ahriman really well. They talk reasonably, they develop respect for one another because they fight alongside one another. And when it comes to the Council of Nicaea, he turns on them. He goes berserk. He calls them witches and sorcerers and heretics, and he sees that they're not. He sees that they're not, that they are loyal, that they are dogmatically loyal to the Imperium and to the Emperor. And it's really sad. It shows you what the agendas of the Space Wolves are. It really does. This is another big change as well. You know, in the previous versions of the Council of Nicaea that occurred in the background, the Emperor doesn't ban the use of psychic powers. Not in the previous versions. What he bans is sorcery, which is considered to be a different thing back then. It's not anymore. What's been revealed, of course, is that the use of psychic powers and sorcery is pretty much the same thing. It's just that one utilizes a different set of traditions and symbolism than the other. That's it. That's the only difference. So in this version of the Council of Nicaea, the Emperor bans the use of psychic powers amongst the legions, which of course not only obliterates the very soul of the Thousand Sons, it destroys their ambitions for humanity. It completely destroys their ambitions for humanity. It reduces them to a husk, basically. And Magnus is so sad. The worst of it is, he is right. Magnus actually argues far more succinctly than anyone who takes the stage, and far more eloquently. But he's condemned for it, and you can see why he does what he does. You can see why he continues to do what he does, even though it might be misguided. It really is quite sad. And it's the aftermath of that event is some of the most tragic writing you'll find in this series. It really is. You get Magnus retreating to his tower on Prospero at the top of the Great Pyramid. He won't see anyone. He goes into seclusion and he meditates. He's trying to work out what is going on, why his father would do this to him, why they can't see, why they can't realize that the warp is just a tool. It's something to be used for the transcendence of humanity. It's not something to be feared, that through fear of it, humanity will damn itself, essentially. And he and his legion do continue practicing their witchery, even though they're banned from it. They do, against the edicts of the Council of Nicaea. But of course, we now know that loads of the other legions do. Loads of them do. The Dark Angels do it. The Ultramarines, good little boys, sailor scouts that they are, they continue to maintain their librarius. A lot of them do. And it's a bit naughty, I've got to say, that the Thousand Sons are condemned for it, whereas a lot of the ones that are considered to be loyalist aren't. But hey-ho, there we are. Oh, by the way, the Space Wolves do as well. Yeah, we do learn that later as well, because the Space Wolves don't consider what they do to be unclean, even though it's the same shit. They continue to not only maintain their rune priests and their Graciers and whatnot, they also continue to practice the rites. They continue to practice their sorcery. It's not enough to keep the mind alive, is it? They are such hypocrites. They're such bloody hypocrites. Anywho, what happens, of course, is that Magnus sees what Horus is doing. He actually is granted a vision of what is happening with Horus, and he tries to stop it. And what's really interesting is the first thing he does is not what's recorded in the general history. He doesn't explode into the Emperor's palace and shatter all these wards and whatnot. That's not what he does. He tries to contact Horus. Because this is before Horus realizes that the Chaos powers are involved, right? He tries to contact Horus, and he does. He actually does manage to reach Horus, and he tells him, look, you are being manipulated. These powers that you are throwing your lot in with, they will end you. They don't want your ascension. They want you to be a sacrifice to them, essentially. And Horus won't listen. Horus makes his own decision, and of course ends up turning. And Magnus doesn't really have any choice at this point. He doesn't really have any choice, so he engages in this. It's one of the most powerful spells he's ever woven, because he has to get through the Emperor's own wards into the Imperial Palace. Now, this is a big change as well. This is a big change. This is the first time in any of the books that you get some indication of what's going on beneath the Imperial Palace. That A, the Golden Throne already exists. It wasn't built to maintain the Emperor's life force. That B, the Emperor is up to something. The Emperor is up to something beneath the Imperial Palace that involves the Webway, that involves sealing off the warp forever, destroying humanity's reliance upon the warp. And you know what? If he just told Magnus, if he just said to Magnus, oh, by the way, this is what I'm doing, please don't fuck it up, please don't explode into the Imperial Palace and destroy all my wards and machinery, because that would be bad, then everything would have been fine. Everything would have been fine. But he doesn't. He doesn't. And as a result, Magnus, he engages in this incredible spell where he projects his sort of metaphysical self through the warp and into the depths of the Imperial Palace. And of course, what that does is it destroys all of the Emperor's equipment. It obliterates part of the Golden Throne, and it collapses all the experiments that he's doing. And there's this moment of, it's the saddest thing. It's the saddest thing. There's this moment of communion between Magnus and the Emperor, where Magnus realizes what he's done and what the Emperor had in mind for him. The Emperor intended Magnus to sit on the Golden Throne, to be the guiding light of humanity through the warp, to be the one who would actually do kind of what Magnus wanted. And it's so sad. And the Emperor doesn't fling him back through the warp. Magnus retreats. He retreats, and he knows. He knows what's going to come. He knows that the Emperor's not going to let this pass. And you know what? Magnus allows it. He's actually the one that shields the Space Wolves from the Thousand Suns. Because, of course, here's another problem in the story as it's previously recorded. How did the Thousand Suns not know that the Space Wolves are coming? These guys can read the ripples of the warp. They can read the future. So how did they not know? They didn't know because Magnus shields the event from them. He actually becomes like a martyr at this point, and he thinks, you know what? Let them come. Let them destroy us. It doesn't matter anymore. Nothing matters anymore. Let them destroy us. And that's what happens. Ahriman desperately tries to convince Magnus to aid them, as the sack of Prospero is one of the saddest moments in the whole Horus Heresy. It's really well drawn as well. You get to see the utter savagery of the Space Wolves as they fall on the cities, these incredible utopian cities, these massive reclusium and colleges and universities that are dedicated to the transcendence of humanity, of gathering knowledge. And it is like the sack of Constantinople to the power of n. It's the burning of the Library of Alexandria to the nth degree. This is the greatest act of savagery in all of human history, and it's the Space Wolves make no distinction between the Thousand Suns and the innocents. They just slaughter. They just kill whoever they come across and burn everything to the ground. You get these really well-drawn moments where Arzek is trying to organize the defense of Prospero. They're trying to utilize their psychic powers to stop the Space Wolves. But of course, the Space Wolves have brought the Null Maidens with them, so it becomes a bit more of a fair fight. Were the Thousand Suns allowed to use their psychic powers, they'd have just swept the Space Wolves from the board. That's made very clear. But the Sisters of Silence make that slightly different, and they put up a good fight. They do. but there's a lot against them at this point. This is where also Zeech makes his influence felt. The Thousand Sons have these familiar spirits that they call tutelaries that allow them to engage with the warp, and to them, they're not demons. They're not conscious entities. They're kind of like projections of their own souls, you know? They are confections of their own intelligence. And what happens is those tutelaries reveal themselves for what they are, which is of course demons. They actually manifest on Prospero and start to attack the Space Wolves, and it's at that point the Space Wolves kind of realize, yep, we're doing the right thing. These guys are damned. These guys, I don't know what they've been doing, but they've been communing with something very unclean, and that's when the Space Wolves get really fierce. And it's also when the flesh change really starts to hit. It's just awful. It's the saddest thing. The Thousand Sons just start to spontaneously mutate, a lot of them, so they're left fighting their own brothers. It's a hideous moment. But you also have at this instance the communion of Magnus with Zeech for the first time, or rather the conscious communion of Magnus with Zeech. And Zeech just reveals himself to Magnus. He just comes to him and says, hello, I'm your real daddy. I'm the one that's given you all the knowledge, all the power. I'm the one that's allowed you to be free this entire time, whilst your false father wants you to be bound to his will. He wants you to sit upon that throne and do as he tells you. Not me. I will allow you to explore and experiment to your heart's degree. So embrace me. Embrace me as your true father, and you will have everything you've ever dreamed of. And beyond that, I will open your mind and soul in ways you have never known. And Magnus, in his despair, obviously makes whatever decision. You know, he makes either the right or the wrong decision, depending on your perspectives. I think he made the right decision, personally. But there's this wonderful moment where it's so dramatic, where he explodes out of the Pyramid of Prospero, and he's wreathed in psychic power. And he actually slides down the side of the pyramid, blasting Space Wolves to bits with his psychic powers, and that's when you get the fight between Lehman and Magnus. It's such a wonderful book, this one. It's brilliantly written. The characters are fantastic. There's not a wasted moment in it. The characters are so well drawn. You come to really love the Thousand Sons. You come to really love Armon and Arzek and all of the others. It is absolutely wonderful. Magnus is such a sympathetic character. He's such a wonderful, sympathetic character. One of my absolute favourites in this series, I've got to say. Next to the likes of Fulgrim and Mortarion and Lorgar and Roboot, one of my absolute favourites. This is one of the best books in the series, bar none. It is also essential reading. If you want to understand what's going on in this series, what's going on in the universe, you need to read this book, because it's so important. I cannot recommend it highly enough, and those that follow on as well, because this series continues throughout the Heresy. You really need to read this to understand what's happening in the Imperium and in the wider Heresy. It's one of the books that elevates the series beyond its sort of pulp origins. It's a wonderful book. Wonderful book, and I cannot recommend it more highly. So, until next time, ladies and gents, bye-bye!